This multimedia presentation is going to focus on what brought Anabaptists from Central Europe to Central Illinois. What were the pushes and the pulls, and how, after a few of them came here, did that serve as a motivation for a greater number to immigrate, especially from the Alsace-Lorraine region on the French-German border. Most of these Anabaptist communities began in either the Netherlands or Switzerland, but due to oppression, they moved to the Alsace-Lorraine, where they began to farm as cheap laborers. However, after these conditions became less than ideal for some, they planned long travels across France to the Atlantic coast, from which they could take ships across the Atlantic all the way up into Philadelphia, sailing up into the harbor, where they could then settle further inland. Many settled in places like Butler County, Ohio, but after clearing acreage there, they looked for more permanent settlements, and many of them ended up in Tazewell County, Illinois. Why did these settlers leave the largely prosperous Swiss 19th century farming communities they were in? Mainly it was because the prosperity was not worth the religious tyranny. Most of these towns and municipalities they had settled in were functionally theocracies that demanded loyalty to a state or town church, and due to their beliefs differing on baptism, age of accountability, and mature acknowledgement of sin, they were persecuted, and the refusal to swear oaths to both the local church and to local militias and state militaries meant that they were often imprisoned or treated as traitors. There is a little bit of nuance to this persecution. As you can see, the countryside rushing by here, Switzerland had all types of farmland, small communities that these families had lived in for decades, if not centuries, most of which had been functioning Protestant homes for many, many generations. Yet, when they had these deep issues, they felt they were not being heard out, that they were being forced to conform. And one of the more controversial things that they really pushed was the need for scripture, and only scripture, to serve as the basis for all church practices. This was not popular with many of the authorities, who felt that there were understood or implied powers that government should have, and that these did not need to be expressly described by Jesus in the New Testament, and that they were implicit and therefore could be used without any sort of biblical reference. As this controversy grew back and forth and people were forced to move off of ancestral homes, this removed many of the roots and served as a way to make them feel more open to moving to the Alsace-Lorraine from Switzerland or the Netherlands, and began this entire movement of finding a location where they could set new roots and create new homes for future generations. Having been welcomed to the Alsace-Lorraine as tenant farmers and migrant workers, why then did these Anabaptists feel the need to leave? What began to happen in this region was increased militarization that we would see crescendo throughout all of Europe into the 20th century. This process was starting to force people to take new oaths into government militias. And so while there was not this sort of theocracy or commitment to a state church in the Alsace-Lorraine, after some generations, many of the Anabaptists felt that the possible threat of looming war and of the need to take oaths was enough to drive them to new lands. While large families did travel in the first wave of immigration from the Alsace-Lorraine to the New World, most of those headed to the United States were smaller families, newlyweds, younger people, sometimes sons and a father, going to establish a settlement to find a homestead and then send for others later. This was mainly because the travel across the Atlantic was expensive and everything had to be reduced to a single wagon per family. Horses could be used to move across France as they got ready to board the boats, but only the wagons themselves typically could be taken across. And so your entire life had to be reduced to a single hand push wagon. While land was very cheap in Ohio and Canada and other regions in between the Great Lakes and the Midwest, the first settlements often were 50-acre plots that had to be cleared by axe and saw. They could be flipped for quite a profit, but the goal was then to make that profit and then move towards areas where larger acreage could be bought, where towns had not yet been established, where the Anabaptists could make their own mark. And so they then transitioned from many of these places further inland to places more like Tazewell County.
A lot of these homes would then be sold, and the family would go on to build a larger farmhouse, build a barn, and establish a 100 or 150-acre farm. Many of those farmlands still staying in family hands here in central Illinois even today.
In central Illinois Anabaptist communities, as found in many others, any sort of large construction, whether it was a house or a barn, would typically be done by the community. Extended family members, people of like faith, people who consider themselves to be fellow Anabaptists will often gather together to raise a house, raise a barn, raise a fellowship hall, raise a new church. And so many of these were extremely well built. And while the one pictured has been reinforced with modern siding, it has lasted for hundreds of years and is currently on display for visitors at the Mennonite Heritage Center in central Illinois. This school is one of those Mennonite constructed buildings. Anabaptists came together to build it for the community. But you can see as we go by the farm here, this is what the larger farms that were built after those first generation farms typically looked like, and many of them survive and are still within family.
This is an Anabaptist church. There are several in the area. Most towns, you'll find school board members, community leaders, all members of Anabaptist churches. Many of the names, such as Roki and Hodel, that are represented at churches like this one, were the same last names of those first settlers who came from Europe.
Those families that stayed in Tazewell County watched as it was restructured into Tazewell, Woodford, and Peoria counties, with a little bit of land also being sent to McLean County. Towns such as Metamora, Roanoke, Eureka, Washington, Tremont, and Mackinac are still made up of the descendants of these original settlers and those that followed them after they knew that with community construction and strong independent towns that they could come here and worship freely and would have family members to help them with their large construction projects and with daily life. Many Anabaptists that live in these counties today still follow the teachings and traditions that brought them here from Europe almost 200 years ago. While Mennonite historical societies and other Anabaptist historical groups have preserved houses and farms and barns, the town of Metamora has gone through great lengths to preserve its old pre-Civil War buildings, many of which were built by Anabaptist shopkeepers, those who had transitioned from farm work into shop work or craftsmanship. And you can see some of these buildings that are almost 200 years old, some older, still today.
We're here in Metamora, a town heavily settled by many of the other Anabaptist families that came to this region. Families like the Belsleys, the Hodels, and the Rokis largely settled here, establishing many of the local businesses, and helping build the town center we see around us. This is a courthouse in which Abraham Lincoln made arguments and had some precedent-setting moments as a young lawyer.
The county courthouse was moved from Metamora to Eureka. This is the newer modern building, roughly World War I era structure. If one looks at county clerks, look at lawyers, look at court officials, look at the justices, look at the sheriffs, look at any of the records and the walls full of veterans from World War I and World War II, Anabaptist names are a plurality in almost all these areas. And Woodford County and Tazewell County, with a little bit of Peoria and McLean County to this day, is largely dominated by these descendants of Swiss, Alsace-Lorrainian immigrants that came here for farmland, that came here for fellowship, they came here for freedom, and came here because family was allowed to support each other here without the risk of outside persecution.